folks. I played on Thursday at the Worcester Chess Club in the Mellow March Open, round 3, against FIDE master John Curdo. He had the white pieces, and he led with e4. I played e5. He played knight c3. I played knight f6, and he played bishop to c4. This is an opening called the Vienna game. I played bishop c5, white played d3, and I played c6, intending to counterattack in the center and hopefully equalize early on with d5. But John played f4. And perhaps I should have played d6 here, and maybe put my bishop on, my queenside knight on d7 and gotten castled kingside. I became very tempted by that d5 counterattack and played that instead, though I have no idea what a computer's evaluation of this move would be. John captured on d5. I took back, and after bishop to b5 check, I played bishop to d7. And it was only after he took on d7 that I realized that this might actually be very bad for black. And that's because if I make a normal recapture like knight b takes d7, then white can play f takes e5, and if I retake on e5, d4 is a fork. But it's probably more complicated than that because the white king is very exposed. And if I move my knight on f6 away, instead of recapturing on e5, the move d4 will solidify white in the center, protect his king by making that center closed, and leave him up a pawn. Very bad position for black, I think. So I ended up playing knight f takes d7 in order to get the knight on f6 out of the way, in case white played f takes e5. But this leaves two pawns under attack, and the pawn on d5 in particular hanging. John could have grabbed one of these pawns, and I suspect he should have taken on d5, though it's a difficult thing to do when that knight's going to be undefended on that square, and black is looking for some kind of opportunity to go after the white king with a timely queen h4 check. So John instead played the solid knight f3, guarding h4, and now threatening to win the pawn on e5. I've got two pawns hanging, so I kind of had to keep going with my attempt to gambit a pawn by playing castle kingside. And John went ahead and took on e5. And at this point, we have what you might call a critical position, because if white gets the opportunity to, he's just going to play d4, be up a pawn, have more space, and have, for the most part, safeguarded his king by closing the center. So I tried for a while to figure out a way to make d4 work, just putting my pawn on that square before white one showed up there, but struggled to find a good continuation. But then I noticed there's knight takes e5, and ended up playing that instead. And the idea is that after knight takes e5, I have a couple of moves here that look pretty strong. Queen h4 check and rook e8. And I was a little bit hesitant to play rook e8, because I thought after d4, this pawn both defends the knight on e5 and attacks the bishop on c5. But this actually could still be a very good position for black. Maybe just queen h4 check is excellent, g3, and queen takes d4. Yeah, this is probably bad for white. So, okay, I could have gone this way, but elected to play queen h4 check instead. John played g3, and I played queen to d4, threatening both queen f2 checkmate and queen takes e5 check, getting the piece back. John played knight to g4. His main alternative was queen e2, guarding against both my threats. Then I thought, after rook e8, since this knight can't move away with check, and since if it moves away in a way that attacks the queen on d4, I get to take his queen with check before moving mine away, this would be very good for black. White, in this position, could defend the knight on e5, but then I was thinking maybe just f6 would grab that knight, and if knight to b5, hassling the queen, queen b4 check threatens to win a second piece. So I think John made the better move, and a move I didn't even look at, knight g4. And there are a couple options here for black. One is to play h5, when this knight can only move to e3 if it moves, otherwise there's going to be queen f2 checkmate. But I decided to bring another piece into the attack instead with rook e8 check. I think maybe bishop to e3 would have been a reasonable move for my opponent, when he may be getting me to give up my rook for 2 minors, which causes me to end up down an exchange instead of a piece, but kind of takes the major part of the sting out of my attack. John played knight e3 instead. Actually, going back a sec, bishop to e3 doesn't actually threaten to take the queen, does it? Because the bishop is currently pinned to the king. So maybe there's just h5 and black easily gets his piece back. Okay, so maybe that's why John played knight to f3 instead. I played knight c6, trying to bring my remaining pieces into the attack. John castled kingside, which gets out of one pin, one on the e-file, but walks into one on this dark squared diagonal. I played queen e5, just looking to play bishop takes e3 check and get my piece back at a time when that would mean black's better because of the continued attack on the white king. John played d4. I had, as another threat, I had this move d4, which would have forked the 2 knights. So John put a pawn on that square, basically to keep mine off of it. I accepted that pawn with bishop takes d4, and now he played rook e1. He wants at some point to reveal an attack on the black queen. And he's defending this knight for a second time, so now after bishop takes e3 check, white can take back there without losing his extra piece. I played queen g5, renewing the threat to win this knight, because I'm still attacking it 3 times, but I no longer have to capture on that square the second time with the queen. And John played king h1. I expected queen f3 here, when white now is threatening to play knight c takes d5, adding another defender to the e3 square and grabbing this d5 pawn, because the threat I had before, which was to just win that pawn with the queen, exploiting the pin along the g1, a7 diagonal, doesn't work anymore because the white queen is also hitting that square. So I thought I'd play a rook a to d8. I thought John would get his king out of the way, and I would play rook e6, looking to continue the attack with either rook f6 or rook h6. But instead, John played king h1 immediately, getting out of the pin, but giving the piece back on e3. Bishop takes e3, bishop takes e3, rook takes e3. And John played queen takes d5 and offered a draw. I thought about this for a while. I had a few more minutes than he did. He was under 20 minutes at this point, and I had 20-something minutes. But I couldn't find a way to continue that would result in a position that's worth playing on from against a FIDE master. I thought about queen to e7 and realized John would play rook takes e3, queen takes e3, rook to f1, hitting the f7 square when I don't have access to the diagonal his king is on because of both his queen and his knight and his rook. And I can come back and defend that e7 square, but then it's white who's in the driver's seat. Now, it's still possible that there's some weakness here on this long diagonal that I can exploit later, but I wouldn't really want to walk into this position against a player of John's caliber. And I thought about queen takes d5, check, knight takes d5, which hits the rook on e3, and so rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, and rook d8. But I thought John would play knight e7 check, when I have to choose between knight takes e7, rook takes e7, when white's already on my 7th rank, which I thought was at the very least not better for black, and king f8, when white can play knight takes c6, b takes c6, and then is on the move in a position in which there are more targets in my camp than his, and in exchange my king's a little more active than his. But again, I didn't think I was better here. So in this position, after queen takes d5, I thought for a while and accepted his draw offer. That puts me at 2.5 out of 3 in that tournament with 1 round to go, as it does for him. And I'm happy with the way I played this game, though I can't wait to use a computer to check that move d5 to see if it's reasonable for me or just losing. Thank you for watching.